The architecture of Africa, like other aspects of the culture of Africa, is exceptionally diverse. Throughout the history of Africa, Africans have had their own architectural traditions. In some cases, broader styles can be identified, such as the Sahelian architecture of an area of West Africa. One common theme in much traditional African architecture is the use of fractal scaling. Small parts of the structure tend to look similar to larger parts, such as the circular village made of circular houses. As with most architectural traditions elsewhere, African architecture has been subject to numerous external influences from the earliest periods for which evidence is available. Western architecture has also influenced coastal areas since the late 15th century, and is now an important source for many larger buildings, particularly in major cities. African architecture uses a wide range of materials. One finds structures in thatch, stick, wood, mud brick, rammed earth, and stone, with the preference for materials varying by region. North Africa for stone and rammed earth, Horn of Africa for dry stone and mortar, West Africa for mud, adobe, Central Africa for thatch, wooden more perishable materials, Southeast and Southern Africa for stone and thatch, wood. Domical, cone on cylinder, cone on poles and mud cylinder. Gabled roofed, pyramidal cone. Rectangle with roof rounded and sloping at ends. Square, dome of flat roof on clay box. Quadrangular, surrounding an open courtyard. Cone on. Early architecture, probably the most famous class of structures in all Africa. The pyramids of Egypt remain one of the world's greatest early architectural achievements, if limited in practical scope and originating from a purely funerary context. Egyptian architectural traditions also saw the rise of vast temple complexes and buildings. Little is known of ancient architecture south and west of the Sahara. Harder to date of the monoliths around the Cross River, which has geometrical human designs. The vast number of Senegambian stone circles also evidence an emerging architecture. North Africa. Egypt's achievements in architecture were varied from temples, enclosed cities, canals, and dams. Maghreban architecture. Thousands of tombs were left by Berbers that were pre-Christian in origin and whose architecture was unique to northwest Africa. The most famous was Tomb of the Christian Woman in western Algeria. This structure contains column-domed and spiraling pathways that lead to a single chamber. Nubian architecture is one of the most ancient in the world. The earliest style of Nubian architecture include the speos, structures carved out of solid rock, an A-group achievement. Egyptians made extensive use of the process at speos Artemidos and Abu Simbel. A group eventually led to C-group. C-group began with light, supple materials, animal skins, and wattle and daub. Later larger more structures of mud bricks became the norm. C-group culture was related to Kerma. Kerma was settled around 2400 BC. It was a walled city containing religious building, large circular dwelling, a palace, and well-laid-out roads. On the east side of the city, funerary temple and chapel were laid out. It supported a population of 2,000. One of its most enduring structures was the Defufa, a mud brick temple. Ceremonies were performed on top. Between 1500 to 1085 BC, Egyptian conquest and domination of Nubia was achieved. This conquest brought about the Napatan phase of Nubian history, the birth of the Kingdom of Kush. Kush was immensely influenced by Egypt and eventually conquered Egypt. During this phase, we see the building of numerous pyramids and temples. Gebel Barkal in the town of Napata was a very significant site. Kushite pharaohs received legitimacy. 13 temples have been excavated and 2 palaces in Napata. Napata has yet to be fully excavated. Nubian pyramids were constructed on three major sites: El Kuru, Nuri, and Meroe. Sudan has more pyramids than Egypt. Sudan contains 223 pyramids. They were smaller than Egyptian pyramids. Nubian pyramids were for kings and queens. The general construction of Nubian pyramids consisted of steep walls, a chapel facing east, stairway facing east, and a chamber access via the stairway. The Meroe site has the most Nubian pyramids and is considered the largest archaeological site in the world. Around AD 350 the area was invaded by the Ethiopian kingdom of Aksum and the kingdom collapsed. Horn of Africa. Aksumite. The best-known building of the period in the region is the ruined 8th century BC multi-story tower at Yeha in Ethiopia, believed to have been the capital of D. Mount. Aksumite architecture flourished in the region from the 4th century BC onward, persisting even after the transition of the Aksumite dynasty to the Zagwe in the 12th century, as attested by the numerous Aksumite influences in and around the medieval churches of Lalibela. Stelae and later entire churches were carved out of single blocks of rock, emulated later at Lalibela and throughout Tigray. Other monumental structures include massive underground tombs often located beneath stelae. The stelae is the single largest monolithic structure ever erected. Other well-known structures employing the use of monoliths include tombs such as the Tomb of the False Door and the tombs of Caleb and Gebra, Meskel in Aksum. Most structures, however, like palaces, villas, commoners' houses, and other churches and monasteries, were built of alternating layers of stone and wood. The protruding wooden support beams in these structures have been named monkey heads, and are a staple of Aksumite architecture and a mark of Aksumite influence in later structures. Some examples of this style had whitewashed exteriors and/or interiors, such as the medieval 12th century monastery of Yemri Hanakrestos near Lalibela, built during the Zagwe dynasty in Aksumite style. Contemporary houses were one-room stone structures, or two-story square houses are round houses of sandstone with basalt foundations. Villas were generally 2 to 4 stories tall and built on sprawling rectangular plans. A good example of still-standing Aksumite architecture is the monastery of Debre Damo from the 6th century. West Africa. Knock-knock culture artifacts have been dated as far back as 790 BCE, located at the Jos Plateau in Nigeria, between the Niger and Benue River. From the excavation of the Knock settlement in Samandikia, there was the tendency to build on peaks. Knock settlements have not been extensively excavated. Tichet Walata. Tichet Walata is the oldest surviving collection of archaeological settlements in West Africa and the oldest of all stone-based settlements south of the Sahara. It was built by the Soninke people and is thought to be the precursor of the Ghana Empire. It was settled by agro-pastoral people around 2000 BCE to 300 BCE, which makes it almost 1,000 years older than previously thought. One finds well-laid-out streets and fortified compounds, all made out of skilled stonemasonry. In all, there were 500 settlements. Medieval architecture. North Africa. The Islamic conquest of North Africa saw Islamic architecture develop in the region, including such famous structures as the Great Mosque of Cairo of the Cairo Citadel. Around 1000 AD, Qob first appears in the Maghreb and Al-Andalus. Horn of Africa. Somalia. Somali architecture is a rich and diverse tradition of engineering and designing multiple different construction types such as stone cities, castles, citadels, fortresses, mosques, temples, aqueducts, lighthouses, towers and tombs during the ancient medieval and early modern periods in Somalia. It also encompasses the fusion of Somalo-Islamic architecture with Western designs in contemporary times. In ancient Somalia, pyramidical structures known in Somali as talo were a popular burial style, with hundreds of these dry stone monuments scattered around the country. Today, houses were built of dressed stone similar to the ones in ancient Egypt, and there are examples of courtyards and large stone walls such as the Warguard Wall enclosing settlements. The peaceful introduction of Islam in the early medieval era of Somalia's history brought Islamic architectural influences from Arabia and Persia, which stimulated a shift in construction from dry stone and other related materials to coral stone, sun-dried bricks, and the widespread use of limestone in Somali architecture. Many of the new architectural designs, such as mosques, were built on the ruins of older structures, a practice that would continue over and over again throughout the following centuries. Aksumite. Throughout the medieval period, Aksumite architecture and influences in its monolithic tradition persisted, with its influence strongest in the early medieval and Zagwe periods. Throughout the medieval period, and especially during the 10th to 12th centuries, churches were hewn out of rock throughout Ethiopia, especially during the northernmost region of Tigray, which was the heart of the Aksumite Empire. However, rock-hewn churches have been found as far south as Adadi Mayam, about 100 kilometers south of Addis Ababa. The most famous example of Ethiopian rock-hewn architecture are the 11 monolithic churches of Lalibela, carved out of the red volcanic tuff found around the town. Though later medieval hagiographies attribute all 11 structures to the eponymous king Lalibela, new evidence indicates that they may have been built separately over a period of a few centuries, with only a few of the more recent churches having been built under his reign. Archaeologist and Ethiopian David Philipson postulates, for instance, that Bet Gabriel Rufel was actually built in the very early medieval period, sometime between 600 and 800 AD, originally as a fortress but was later turned into a church. West Africa, Ghana. At Kumbi Sala, locals lived in domed-shaped dwellings in the king's section of the city, surrounded by a great enclosure. Traders lived in stone houses in a section which possessed 12 beautiful mosques, one centered on Friday prayer. The king is said to have owned several mansions, one of which was 66 feet long, 42 feet wide, contained 7 rooms, was 2 stories high, and had a staircase, with the walls and chambers filled with sculpture and painting. Sahelian architecture initially grew from the 2 cities of Jenne and Timbuktu. The Sangoma Mosque in Timbuktu, constructed from mud on timber, was similar in style to the Great Mosque of Jenne. Kanem-Bornu's capital city Berne Negazagamu may have had a population of 200,000. It had 4 mosques which could hold up to 12,000 worshippers. It was surrounded by a 25-foot wall and more than 1 mile in circumference. Many large streets extended from the esplanade and connected to 660 roads. The main building and structure were built with red brick. Other buildings were built with straw and adobe. Hausa kingdoms. 6 important Hausa city-states existed: Kano, Katsina, Dora, Gobir, Zaza, and Biram. Kano was the most important. The city was surrounded by a wall of reinforced ramparts of stone and bricks. Kano contained a citadel near which the royal class resided. Individual residence was separated by an earthen wall. The higher the status of the resident, the more elaborate the wall. The entranceway was maze-like to seclude women. Inside near the entrance were the abode of unmarried women. Further down were slave quarters. Benin. The rise of kingdoms in the West African coastal region produced architecture which drew on indigenous traditions, utilizing wood. The famed Benin City, destroyed by the punitive expedition, was a large complex of homes in coursed mud, with tipped roofs of shingles or palm leaves. The palace had a sequence of ceremonial rooms, and was decorated with brass plaques. The walls of Benin City are collectively the world's largest man-made structure. Fred Pierce wrote in New Scientist, they extend for some 16,000 kilometers in all, in a mosaic of more than 500 interconnected settlement boundaries. They cover 6,500 square kilometers and were all dug by the Edo people. In all, they are 4 times longer than the Great Wall of China, and consumed 100 times more material than the Great Pyramid of Cheops. They took an estimated 150 million hours of digging to construct, and are perhaps the largest single archaeological phenomenon on the planet. Ashanti architecture from Ghana is perhaps best known from the reconstruction at Kumasi. Its key features are courtyard-based buildings, and walls with striking reliefs in mud plaster brightly painted. An example of a shrine can be seen at Borgias in Ghana. 4 rectangular rooms, constructed from wattle and daub, lie around a courtyard. Animal designs mark the walls, and palm leaves cut at tiered shape provide the roof. Yoruba. The Yoruba surrounded their settlements with massive mud walls. The buildings had a similar plan to the Ashanti shrines, but with verandas around the court. The walls were of puddled mud and palm oil. The most famous of the Yoruba fortifications and the second largest wall edifice in Africa is Sungbo's Eredo, a structure that was built in honor of a traditional Oloi by the name of Bilikisu Sungbo in the 9th, 10th and 11th centuries. It is made up of sprawling mud walls and the valleys that surrounded the town of Ijebu-Ode in Ogun State. Sungbo's Eredo is the largest pre-colonial monument in Africa, larger than the Great Pyramid of Great Zimbabwe. East Africa. Ngaruka is a ruined settlement on the slopes of Mount Ngorongoro in northern Tanzania. 7 stone terraced villages along the mountainside comprised the settlement. A complex structure of stone channel irrigation was used to dike dam and level surrounding river waters. The stone channels run along the mountainside and base. Some of these channels were several kilometers long, channeling and feeding individual plots of land. The irrigation channels fed a total area of 5,000 acres. Burundi never had a fixed capital. The closest thing was a royal hill. When the king moved, the location became the capital, called the Nsego. The compound itself was enclosed inside a high fence. The compound had 2 entrances. One was for herders and herds. The other was to the royal palace. This palace was surrounded by a fence. The royal palace had 3 royal courtyards. Each served a particular function: one for herders, of sanctuary, kitchen and granary. Rwanda Nyanza was a royal capital of Rwanda. The king's residence, the Ibwami, was built on a hill. The surrounding hills were occupied by permanent or temporary dwellings. These dwellings were round huts surrounded by big yards and high-hedged or separate compounds. The Ruga, the royal compound, was made of circular reed fence around thatched houses. The houses were carpeted with mats and had a clay hearth in the center for the king, his wife, and entourage. The royal house was close to 200 to 100 yards. It looked like a huge maze of connected huts and granaries. It had one entrance that led to a large public square called the Karubanda, Katara and Bunyoro. In western Uganda one finds numerous earthworks near the Katonga River. These earthworks have been affiliated with the Empire of Katara. The most famous Big Obiya Mugani is about 4 square miles with the Katonga River on one side. The earthwork ditch was dug out by cutting through solid bedrock and earth, about 200,000 cubic meters. It was about 12 feet high. It is not certain whether the function was for defense or pastoral use. Very little is known about the Ugandan earthworks. Buganda, the capital of Buganda, constantly changed from hill to hill, with each change of Kabaka. In the late 19th century, a permanent kibuga of Buganda was established at Menga Hill. The capital was divided into quarters corresponding to provinces. Each chief built a dwelling corresponding to provinces. Each chief built a dwelling for wife, slaves, dependents, and visitors. The city was 1.5 miles wide. Large plots of land were available for planting bananas and fruits. Roads were wide and well maintained. Nubia. The Christianization of Nubia began in the 6th century. Its most representative architecture are churches. They are based on Byzantium basilicas. The structures are relatively small and made of mud bricks. Vernacular architecture of the Christian period is scarce. Architecture of Soba is the only one that has been excavated. The structures are of sun-dried bricks, same as present-day Sudan, except for an arch. During the Fatimid phase of Islam, about the 11th century, Nubia converted to Islam and became Arabized. Its most important mosque was the Mosque of Dare. Swahili states, farther south, increased trade and the development of ports saw the birth of Swahili architecture, developed from an outgrowth of indigenous Bantu settlements. One of the earliest examples is the Palace of Husuni Kubwa lying west of Kilwa, built about 1245. As with many other early Swahili buildings, coral was the main construction material, and even the roof was constructed by attaching coral to timbers. Contrastingly, the palace at Kilwa was a 2-story tower in a walled enclosure. Other notable structures from the period include the pillar tombs at Malindi and Mnarani in Kenya, and elsewhere, originally built from coral but later from stone. Later examples include Zanzibar's Stone Town, with its famous carved doors, and the Great Mosque of Kilwa. Central Africa. Congo. Mbanza. Congo was the capital of the Kingdom of Congo with a population of 30,000 plus. It sat on a cliff with river below and forested valley. The king's dwelling was described as 1.5 miles enclosure with walled pathways, courtyard, gardens, decorated huts, and palisades. One early explorer described it in terms of a Cretan labyrinth. Cuba. The capital of the Cuba Kingdom was surrounded by a 40-inch high fence. Inside the fence were roads, a walled royal palace, urban buildings. The palace was rectangular and in the center of the city. Luba. The Luba tended to cluster in small villages, with rectangular houses facing a single street. Kilolo. Patrilineal chieftains headed local village government under the protection of the king. Cultural life centered around the Kitonta, the royal compound, which later came to be a permanent capital. The Kitonta drew artists, poets, musicians and craftsmen, spurred by royal and court patronage. Lunda. The Lunda Empire established its capital 100 kilometers from Kasai in open woodland, between two rivers 15 kilometers apart. It was surrounded by fortified earthen ramparts and dry moats about 30 plus km. The Mwato Yamvas compound Musumba was surrounded with large fortification of double-layered live trees or wood ramparts. The Musumba had multiple courtyards with designated functions, straight roads, and public squares. Its immense hygienic and cleanly value has been noted by European observers. Eastern Lunda. The Eastern Lunda dwelling of the Casemap was described as containing fenced roads, 1 mile long. The enclosed walls were made of grass, 12 to 13 span in height. The enclosed roads lead to a rectangular hut opened on the west side. In the center was a wooden base with a statue on top about 3 span. Miravi. The Miravi people built bridges called Uraro due to changing river depth. These bridges were made out of bamboo. Bamboos were placed parallel to each other and tied together by bark. One end of the bridge would be tied to an existing tree. The bridge would curve downward 80 spans when entering. A bamboo on top would serve as a balustrade. Southern Africa. In Southern Africa, one finds ancient and widespread traditions of building in stone. 2 broad categories of these traditions have been noted. 1. Zimbabwean style. 2. Transvaal Free State style. North of the Zambezi one finds very few stone ruins. The Indian Ocean island of Madagascar, geopolitically part of southern Africa, is culturally distinct as reflected by the Southeast Asian influences in its architectural styles brought to the island by the first seafaring migrants to settle there. Afrikaner Cape Dutch architecture is a traditional South African Afrikaner architecture and is one of the most distinctive styles of settler architecture in the world. It is known as the Cape Dutch style because it developed during the century and a half that the Cape was a Dutch colony. Even at the end of that period, at the beginning of the 19th century, the colony was inhabited by fewer than 50,000 people, mostly of white and brown complexion. This number was spread over an area roughly the size of the United Kingdom. Yet, despite the small number over such a vast area, the Cape Dutch style was of an amazing consistency, clearly related to rural architecture in northwestern Europe, but equally clearly with its own unmistakable African character and features. Shona Mapungubwe is considered the most socially complex society in southern Africa, the first southern African culture to display economic differentiation. The elite was separated on a mountain settlement made of sandstone. It was the precursor to Great Zimbabwe. Large tracts of dirt was carried to the top of the hill. At the bottom of the hill was a natural amphitheatre and at the top elite graveyard. There was only 2 pathways to the top. One was a narrow steep cleft along the side of the hill which observers at the top had a clear view. Great Zimbabwe is the largest medieval city in sub-Saharan Africa. Great Zimbabwe was constructed and expanded for more than 300 years in a local style that eschewed rectilinearity for flowing curves. Neither the first nor the last of some 300 similar complexes located on the Zimbabwean plateau. Great Zimbabwe is set apart by the terrific scale of its structure. Its most formidable edifice, commonly referred to as the Great Enclosure, has dressed stone walls as high as 36 feet extending approximately 820 feet, making it the largest ancient structure south of the Sahara Desert. Houses within the enclosure were circular and constructed of wattle and daub, with conical thatch roofs. Thulamela was a counterpart of Mapungubwe and Great Zimbabwe that displayed similar architectural design and method. Kami was the capital of the Tor state and the successor of Great Zimbabwe. The techniques of Great Zimbabwe were further refined and developed. Elaborate walls were constructed by connecting carefully cut stones forming terraced hills. Sotho-Tswana architecture represent the other stone building tradition of southern Africa, centered in the Transvaal, Highveld north and south of the Vaal. Numerous large stone-walled enclosures and stone-housed foundations have been found in the region. The capital Molokwini of the Kwina was a stoned-wall town as large as the eastern Lunda capital. Zulu and Nguni. Zulu architecture was constructed with more perishable materials. Dome-shaped huts typically comes to mind when one thinks of Zulu dwellings, but later on it evolved into dome over cylinder-shaped walls. Zulu capitals were elliptical in shape. The exterior was lined with durable wood palisade. Domed huts in rows of 6 through 8 lined the interior of exterior palisades. In the center of the capital city was the kraal, used by the king to examine his soldiers, holding cattle, or ceremonies. It was an empty circular area at the center of the capital, lined with less durable palisades compared to the exterior palisades. The entrance of the city was opposite to the highly fortified royal enclosure called the Izigodlo. This was the general makeup of Zulu Capitals Mgunga and Lavu and Ulundi. Indabella architecture. Madagascar. The Southeast Asian origins of the first settlers of Madagascar are reflected in the island's architecture, typified by rectangular dwellings topped with a peaked roof and often built on short stilts. The more East African coastal dwellings are generally made of plant materials, while those of the Central Highlands tend to be constructed in cob brick. The introduction of brick-making in the 19th century by European missionaries led to the emergence of a distinctly Malagasy architectural style that blends the norms of traditional wooden aristocratic homes with European details. Namibia. Kaksa. Nas was a wall construction in southeastern Namibia built by Ulam. Its perimeter was 700 meters and 2 meters in height. It was built with stone slabs and displays features of both the Zimbabwean and Transvaal Free State style of stone construction.